I'm going to talk a bit about ethics within data science in a public service media context. So as was alluded to, I work for the BBC, so there's a certain sort of interesting dynamic, I think, that happens with companies that are publicly funded and have public remits, and what we can sort of bring to this conversation because of our sort of particular financial incentives being quite different, I think, than a lot of more traditional corporate actors. So I should also say that this talk really is a synthesis of two academic papers that my team and BBC R&D have collaborated on. One that's a position paper on public service recommender algorithms, and another that is talking about how you can human center similarity spaces. And at the end of this, I'll put some links to resources in the slide deck, so don't worry about scribbling down very small links just now. So as I said, this is a broad sort of piece on data science and public service media, but we're mostly going to focus on recommender systems because I only have 20 minutes. And in particular, sort of exploring what it might mean to talk about the notion of a public service recommender algorithm, a recommender that's optimized for a broader public good and not just the sort of needs of a single organization or actor. So why do we care about this? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. One of them is that is an interesting conversation to have because there's a broad sort of discourse going on about a lot of these issues across various national public service entities. So there's an organization called the EBU, that's the European Broadcasting Unit, which if you don't know the acronym, you probably know them because of this thing called Eurovision that they put on every year. But they're also the kind of body that represents all the public broadcasters like the BBC from various nations, actually beyond Europe, so like the Israeli broadcasters part of it. NPR from the US is a member because there's not a sort of global one, there's just the Europe one, so they represent a lot of other orgs. Big conversation about how we can sort of serve the public, but also use the tools of data science and analytics and automatic decision making. We also are really interested in this dynamic about the potential to undermine shared and collective experiences. So when we broadcast the news many decades ago, everyone sat down at their TV and watched it together. So there was a certain sort of shared common understanding of information. There was great mention in the last talk about the sort of prevalence of deep fakes, but it's also a sort of case that if everyone's reading their own text news articles and everyone has a different collection of information in their heads, we are sort of seeing a kind of stratification of what people have in their own head, what information they're being exposed to, and this could potentially be a problem because if we don't all have the same shared understanding of the world around us, it makes it difficult to make decisions. There's also a bit of a problem where if you just read what you want, if you just watch the things that are selected for you to make you happy, we may be reinforcing your pre-existing conditions rather than beliefs, rather than potentially challenging them where that might be beneficial to everyone around you. And there's also this sort of idea where if what you end up doing effectively is giving people what they want, you sort of surround someone in their own cocoon of happiness, and they can sort of stare at the world around them but not participate in it. And again, this is a sort of, what you see as a kind of breakdown of a notion of commons with information sharing. So the kind of counter to all of this, so that's the kind of why public service organizations might want to do these kinds of things. Why are we different? Well, we're different because if you look at a commercial organization, a commercial news broadcaster, a commercial media company, a commercial platform like Netflix or something, they all have a very easy way to measure whether or not they're doing something correct, and because, are they successful in the market? Is their bottom line growing? Are they making more money at less expense, right? Some of these things matter in a public service organization, but they don't matter as directly or as narrowly. This is my straw man. So the other thing is that so the BBC, if we don't have a kind of bottom line driven approach, then what is our driving factor? So I will, as a BBC employee on the stage, quote Reith and say that the sort of point is to inform, educate, and entertain. This is the sort of the core mission of the BBC, effectively. And this is where you can sort of synthesize out our metrics, right? So are we doing this well? Are we doing this sufficiently? Now it's just 4 words, so obviously there's a bit of work to get out some sort of meaningful guidance. So what we're trying to think about here really is to get guidance on how we can move the public. And the problem is that while there is various conversations that have gone on about how we can do this, they're generally vague, and so it's very difficult to go from the kind of conversation that's happened to how am I going to build a model that meets these needs? How am I going to measure that that model did that? How are we going to change the way the organization talks about using data in processes and in decision making that better meets these needs, right? So in another way, how can we make sure that the values of a public service organization align with the actual behavior of a tool that we build like a recommender? So I'm going to go through about 5 sort of questions that kind of pose this in a reasonably formal way. The first one is how we operationalize public service media into contexts. So a brief caveat for anyone else in the audience who works for a different public service organization, especially from a different country. A fun thing about those 2 words is that everyone who works in a different organization has a different definition of them. So this is the sort of BBC understanding of what public service means. If you work for NPR or RAI or any of the litany of other public service organizations, we can have a bickery conversation about whether or not I'm correct after the talk. So I think the key challenges here are really about how we operationalize, how we make real the ideas around things like diversity, surprise, shared experiences, common understanding, right? So some of these things lend themselves well to measurement, some of them maybe do not. And indeed, one of the things that's really critical around something like diversity is that before we can measure it in a coherent way, we have to have a shared agreement, at least as an organization, if not as a community of people, about what it means, right? So here, Helberger is talking about something called exposure diversity, which is generally taken to mean that you have seen a sort of maximally wide spread of items in something like a recommender system. But again, like, if you say diversity, what does that mean? How can we measure it? How can we write it down? So if you've agreed on a metric, then you have this sort of follow-up of how much are we willing to give up? So classically for a recommender, this probably means accuracy. You can think about that in a search context as well. So there's a kind of classic measurement of how good your search or your recommender is, which typically is its predictive power in a narrow sense, its accuracy. How much of that can we lose in favor of other metrics? If we've got a litany of metrics instead of one, then you've got a trade-off, right? So I think the thing that I would put out there is that these trade-offs will be made anyway, even if you only have one metric. And the thing that lots of organizations need to sort of spend time thinking through is what are these trade-offs that we're making without thinking about them? How can we bring them to the fore? How can we make them explicit? And the other thing on this is a lot of times you can bring other forms of research. So there was, in that last talk, some great conversation about a sort of standard scientific method approach. There are other research methodologies as well that may well be present in your organizations already. Things like UX methodologies, user research, various qualitative methods. There's lots of like audience survey panels that exist in media companies. All these things can bring guidance when you have to make a decision about preferring one metric over another. So if we think about another sort of thing that comes up a lot in these conversations, an idea of transparency. Transparency is an exciting word because it can be quite woolly. So when we say transparency, what are we talking about in terms of the audience of that transparency, right? So are we talking about regulators? Are we talking about someone else? If we're talking about regulators, then we probably mean that the public service organization has to respond to its auditors, to its regulatory bodies, to its public. And that kind of transparency might be, this is the data we used to train an algorithm, this is the particular parameters that we set, this is why we set them, etc. This is quite different, I think, than transparency owed to an audience, right? And I just went through this. The other sort of side of this is how we design interpretability or explainability, and to make sure that we're making decisions in a way that allows for some degree of accountability, because as an organization that makes its money by being given it by the taxpayer, we have to make sure that we're accountable to our public, right? And so I think, there's a sort of tie with transparency here. So there's this idea of sort of disclosure with organizations that are publicly funded, and that ties in here. But there's also this idea of meaningful explanation for a user. And it's worth sort of drawing this out for a second, because meaningful explanation may not actually be tied to how a thing works. So if I am recommending 4 news articles that are related in some way that I can calculate to the news article that you're currently reading, it may be more helpful for me to tell you how those things relate to each other in a way that's distinct and different from how the algorithm chose them. Because that may help you make a decision, and it may be useful, but it's not telling you how the thing worked. And that may be actually a distraction. If I say, well, it's a recursive neural network, we trained it with a couple of years worth of data, we pre-processed it in this fashion, that's the average reader probably doesn't want all of that detail. What they want to know is that they're reading an article about Brexit. They've read 3 articles about Brexit. Here's an article about kittens at their shelter, because they need a break, and our system sort of figured that out, right? So I think, there's this idea also of like the sort of preference for complexity, because complexity sounds fancy. So this came up a bit earlier this morning on the panel with the Data Frontiers group. Sometimes people who do data science can be very excited about very ornate models, very complicated models. They can be very good and very effective, but there are almost always downsides to complexity. So one obvious downside to complexity is that it's harder to productionize, but they tend to also be harder models to explain. And here I mean the actual mechanical explanation, how they're working. And so thinking about these kinds of hidden costs of complexity can be a really useful thing to go through when you're kind of weighing different approaches and solutions. And there's also this idea of what might be possible within an explanation. So certain kinds of models may allow you to, for instance, highlight feature importance in certain selections. Some models may be fairly complete black boxes that are quite opaque, in which case you may need a totally separate system to do some kind of user-facing explanation. And then there's this sort of idea of oversight. So if what we're doing is creating an audit log for a regulator, then what explanation may need is approximately everything we can possibly generate that's sort of put on ice unless someone asks for it. And similarly, there's this kind of dichotomy here, right? So are we designing for a regulator? Are we designing for internal stakeholders? Are we designing for an editorial view in a news context? Are we designing for users, for the public? So along those lines, where's the kind of level of explanation? So you can think about this as are we just saying, well, we know that you read some news, here is some other news we think you would like. I mean, that is an explanation, right? We're saying this is the situation that we have observed, here's more stuff. It's a very, very high level, probably not that useful. The explanation may vary between an editorial team. So if I go to my news editorial team and I say, we're going to give the readers more stuff to read that you've written, they're going to be like, why do I care? That's not helpful. What they want to know is why the system recommends the things they do so that can inform their own news gathering process, right? And that's a different level qualitatively than the kind of thing that's going to benefit a user, right? So when we're explaining to users, it's different than explaining to experts, right? How much do we think that the audience we're explaining to understands the domain, and how can we dial our explanation in to take care of that? And how far apart are these? So in some domains, you can imagine that actually the distance between a sort of expert and someone who's just kind of going along with things is actually quite small. And in some, it can be vast, right? How much education does it take to become an expert in a particular domain is probably a reasonably good indication of how much this distance might actually be in practice. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes or so just running through a couple of things that my teams have done over the last year or so in some recommenders that are out and in the public to sort of work through some of these things. So what we're really trying to do is to better align the way our recommenders work to our sort of explicit values as an organization, right? So this is BBC Mundo. BBC Mundo is a news site that serves the Latin American market, so it's Spanish language. And the audience that we have in mind for this is Central and Southern America, the Spanish-speaking community in Latin America. Here's an article that was published about a year ago concerning some fighting between Google and China over regulatory frameworks. And down about 6 paragraphs into the article, you see this block that roughly translates to say other things you might be interested in Spanish, and then lists 4 articles. So this is our news article-to-article recommender that sits on 6 of our foreign language sites now. And the way that those articles get populated is through a sort of understanding of how articles are similar to one another that's calculated entirely from the text. So we use a methodology called latent derivative allocation that's a bit out of scope for the time I have, but we're effectively calculating this through the written text and nothing else. So that's cool, but how do we know if our sort of entirely measured and calculated form of similarity is actually aligned with human opinion? So there's a fun thing that happens when you ask a journalist or an editor if 2 articles are similar. They tell you a story, right? And like that's great, but it's not something you can rank. And so how can I take 70,000 articles and get humans to help me rank them and then compare those ranks, right? So what we've done is we have a regime of testing where we compare an anchor article, an input article, to two other articles, and we say which of these two is closer. And we do that with a lot of people, with a lot of articles, and what we can do is build a sort of human-generated probabilistic model to say, well, usually this article is closer across the population by this much. So we repeat this over lots and lots of people. We've done this internally with editors. In theory, you could do this with the public as well, and that would probably produce slightly different answers because, again, experts are different than the public. So here's a nice spreadsheet example. So what we can do once we've generated this with a lot of people is we can say, well, the people more or less align with one of our model configurations. So this is using the Portuguese site, which is our Brazilian news service. And so you have a list of articles, and then you have a list of comparator articles, and then the distance that our model has generated between the base article in A and the base article in B, and then whether or not this particular human evaluator has agreed with the human model in picking the one that was closer or disagreed. So the disagreements are not highlighted and the agreements are in green. So in this case, a slight majority of these particular articles corresponded to human opinion, this human's opinion. So you do this in aggregate, and what you can get is you can say, well, so we have a model with a particular parameter. This is an unsupervised model, so it has, you can set the number of topics, which is basically the number of sort of clumps of coherent English or coherent language. So here we have three different configurations of the model, 30, 50, and 70 topics, and across those we can say the humans aligned with the 50 topic model far more than with the 30 or the 70 topic model. And again, this is with experts. I would almost certainly expect a different answer than if I was doing this sort of wider with the public. But this gives us a lot of guidance for how we might be able to select models that are themselves opinionated, right? Like it's misleading to think about this as a factual exercise, right? What we're doing is we're building a robot that has an opinion. And what we want to do is make sure that that opinion sits within the sort of acceptable spread of human opinions, right? And so this gives us guidance for which one sort of will drift towards the center of that human opinion. We will almost certainly revisit this over time to sort of examine drift within models and this kind of thing. Yeah, so this is about really just steering. And that's really it. I'm going to leave it with that. And that is it. So thank you very much.